Okay, are we all here? So, welcome back to This is Good. And all of our panelists, I think, are here. We've got Azam Ahmed from Mexico City, Vanessa Friedman, Mike Schmidt, Pui-Wing Tam from San Francisco. We're going to have a question for Pui-Wing in a minute. And an interloper, Sarah Lyall, is rudely crashing our party this week. She pulled rank on Sam Dolnick. Nice to have you, Sarah.
Nice to be here.
Pui-Wing, I think we need to warn the other panelists. I heard that, is it accurate that you are surveilling your reporters, like digitally, electronically monitoring everything they're doing throughout the course of the day to make sure that they're productive? What's going on there?
We did a journalistic experiment where one of the reporters installed employee monitoring surveillance software on his computer and then let me surveil him, and it was very uncomfortable to see the amount of data that this software was collecting, and including screenshots of calls like this. And he wrote about it, and we decided never to do it again, and we've uninstalled everything.
Could you surveil Schmidt for a couple days if we asked you to?
I'm not sure I would want to.
That's pretty boring.
Yeah.
Pretty boring. Okay, so this week's piece is from the archives, the Wall Street Journal, reporter Kevin Helliker. And in 2008, The Heart Has Its Reasons, selected by Azam. Azam, why don't you tell us why you picked it, your thoughts?
Okay. So the story is about this sort of pillar of local society who winds up starting a program for dogs in the local prison, local penitentiary. She's grew up in the same area, married to her high school sweetheart, just kind of prototypical Americana, and then suddenly falls in love with one of the prisoners, a man accused of murder, and sneaks him out of prison and basically upends her entire life by escaping with him for a few days before she and the man are caught. He's sentenced to prison. He goes back to prison, and she goes to prison as well. So why I picked it? It was, it felt like one of those stories where you see the possibility of, and the crazy unpredictability of humans. As the title suggests, the heart has its reasons. I don't even think she knows, at least according to the interviews with the reporter, why she did it. Just that she did this completely unpredictable and wild thing that kind of expresses something quite dark about people, but also something quite beautiful, which I think is the fact that someone who's lived this completely ordinary life, who we would all like to sort of posit a certain frame of mind on, can do something completely unexpected and life upending. And I thought that was remarkable because it's not a typical news story. It's kind of the stuff that the Journal used to do way back in the day when they would do these wild narratives that kind of had nothing to do with the news, but expressed something about people. And I felt like this was, I felt like it was a unique expression of that.
So you've been thinking about this for like, what, 12 years now? And honestly, so when you think of it, do you think of it as a love story?
I mean, it's definitely a love story, but it's also, who knows what was going on in their heads, but I thought what was special about it is, again, that she could completely upend every single thing that you would assume her DNA and her experience in life had led her to be, turn her back on her family, take up with a man much younger with a much more checkered past, to the point that she would sneak him out of prison. So no, I think it's not my favorite piece of journalism ever written, but I thought it would be interesting because it is a unique kind of story. And I think it reminds me that when I'm covering stories that seem very typical or normal, that there's often an element that's unexpected or, maybe not, doesn't confine to what I assume I know about something.
Mm-hmm. What do you guys think?
I thought it was really great. I think that the way the reporter let the story unfold was really masterful. You could have, starting to read it, you weren't really sure, as you said, Oz, what direction it would take. And it starts to unfold very, very slowly. A lot of the best details are sort of thrown in there in like little asides. So it takes you a page, I printed it out. So it takes you 1/10 of the story or whatever to get into where she is at the time of the story. And you're sort of reading and you're like, okay, so she upends her life and blah, blah, blah. And then you get this quote from her where it says, she said, still notably sheepish that she was being interviewed behind the screen at a maximum, security penitentiary. And, there's just one crazy detail after another. There's amazing quotes in it. I think his use of quotes is extraordinary. The fact he interviewed so many different people, and it sort of unfolds very, very slowly and delightfully so that the details accrue as you go. Like, I think the narrative is a really well-told narrative.
Did he give away too much at the top?
No, I thought the opposite. I was thinking how you could do it if you were just like a typical story. You'd be like, the story, includes like escape in a van, and it includes this and money and blah, blah, blah. And very little is actually revealed. And there's no paragraph that says, in interviews with dozens of her friends and family members and this, a picture emerged of so-and-so. It's much more allowed to sort of unfold as it goes. And when you get to the part where she's interviewed and you hear from the guy and you hear from some other people, the use of quotes, as I say there, the metaphors that they use that come out later on are so extraordinary. And she's quoting Blaise Pascal, "The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing." In the middle of this interview, she says that he's an amazing manager. He says she's like Mother Teresa. You get all that way down into the story. And then the details of the escape are so excellent too. And you don't hear that till right at the end. It's great.
I want to know how he fit himself into the box.
He lost all that weight and worked out.
What was the position that he dreamed of? That
He didn't even get into the box in the prison, though. Like
dog food box,
no one was watching him.
so
I'm going to say that's the latitude.
Have you guys been following this story about the American ex-military guys who
Venezuela,
right, tried to overthrow the president of Venezuela? So one of the members of the U.S. Special Forces who's still detained down there, his family has been, quoted in news stories. And so his wife was describing how they had, he was working an offshore oil rig, and everything seemed to be normal. She had absolutely no idea that he was communicating with this Justin Goudreau character, who was like the leader of this band of mercenaries. And he just disappeared. Like, he had this whole other life happening. And reading that and then reading this piece, it's just incomprehensible to me how people are able to pull that off. I feel like I don't know, it's just not in my DNA to go buy bread at the grocery store without telling people what I'm doing. And do you guys did that strike you as well? Or are you guys super secretive and leading double lives? Go.
I'm in plenty of people in prison myself, and no one in my family knows about it. It's really easy to do, actually. You just have a bunch of burner cell phones and some, secret bank accounts. No problem at all. I think, part of what's so interesting about this story is that you start off and it could be, again, this straightforward account of like a prison break-in and blah, blah, blah. And it's really a story about a lonely middle-aged woman whose husband didn't understand her, who got married too young, who was lost and no one paid attention to her. And all of a sudden she found somebody to tell her she was hot, and she found a new thing to do. And her husband didn't really care enough, even when she kept saying, "I want a divorce." He laughed and said, "Oh, don't be silly." And he didn't drink, and he had a job, and he had a truck or whatever. And so he thought that would be enough to keep her. And he wasn't paying attention at home. That was the problem there.
Yeah, not paying attention is an understatement, right? Because what was it? The month before this whole escapade, she had spent 12,000 minutes on the phone with him.
Yeah.
I think 12,000 is the number of minutes in a month, right? So she
told her she wasn't capable of an affair.
Yeah.
Just like,
that's not very nice at all to say to your wife.
Did you believe that guy was in love with her, or did you think he was using her? I
think both. I think you don't get a lot of, in prison, there's not a lot of options. So a nice older woman with money and dogs and wants to listen to you comes in, and you might well fall in love with her,
But you couldn't really tell what his thinking was. He did have that letter that he wrote, that letter to the writer that said that it was sort of the high point of his life, this 12 days away with the woman after they'd escaped. But you couldn't really, I guess they didn't actually get to talk. Because you couldn't really get a true sense of what else he was sort of thinking or feeling about it.
Yeah, you don't know much about his background or how he grew up. I mean, it says like he was a kind of juvenile delinquent, not because his family made him that way, but because he was just like acting out or something. It was, I don't have much of a sense of him at all.
But did you guys think there was a lot of this story that seemed familiar to you? Maybe it's just because I read people.com all the time, but and have a lot of tabloid sensibilities, but like the woman falling in love with an inmate, that sounded familiar. I mean, I read every word of this story, I drank it up, but in the end I was like, oh, I've kind of seen this story before.
Yeah,
women.
I felt that way, especially because Escape from Dannemora, which I'd watched like a year or two ago, it seemed like pretty much the same exact story, and I thought that was done really well. And this one, I was kind of like, okay, I know the story, and it just kept on going and going, and I was like, there was a familiarity to it that struck me as like, oh, I've seen this before, even though I hadn't seen the story before. Yeah. The other thing that I found sort of interesting when I looked at it was, I usually really like stories where there's like one factor, if you took it out, the whole thing would fall apart. Like the police are chasing, the bad guy, and they only find like, and they're able to get him. And, I love that kind of thing. In this case, that existed here, where if she never went to work at the prison with the dogs, like the whole story wouldn't exist. But I didn't find that interesting, because I was like, well, if she never went to the prison, we'd never have a story. So what would have happened? She just would have kind of been this unhappy person. It didn't have the same electricity to it, where in the chase after the robber, if they didn't get the cell phone, they never would have gotten him. In this case, it was like, well, I guess you just would have been unhappy.
Like, it's not a movie. Like, it actually happens. They have to say what happened. You know what I mean? Like, that's how she got into the prison,
I love the fact that it doesn't bother with him. He's a much more salubrious and interesting character, this criminal, but instead it like spends all this time with this person who the world would largely forget in other circumstances, delving into her emotional emptiness and the reasons why she did something extraordinary. I mean, not extraordinarily good, but something that was so out of character, and out of character for most people. It's not common to focus so much attention on someone who, someone's mundane love life that then becomes crazy.
One of our attendees is pointing out in the chat that there's a blog post out there that it offers an interesting theory on why she did this. If somebody in this group is nimble enough to go, Mike, why don't you do that? Why don't you read that and come back and tell us what the theory is?
You can read, Mike, from the chat.
The thing about reading this story 12 years later is that it sent me on this Googling frenzy for what has happened to these characters since. Yeah. I don't know if any others of you guys did that.
I did very briefly.
I couldn't find much information on him, but Toby Phalen Young, she obviously served her sentence, and then it appears that she remarried to a different guy. And then now appears to be like a motivational speaker and is using her experience. She's doing like these workbooks for convicted women and she was writing a memoir, and it's all under this rather cheesy rubric of unleashed. So I was a little bit disappointed by this whole unleashed situation. But anyway, it was interesting to kind of try and figure out what has happened to these people.
Is she still in that area?
It appeared to be so, yeah. She has a website up. Her last name is different now. It's her married name now, but she seems to be still
she's a really
giving interviews.
Poignant figure. I mean, when her sister was interviewed and she said, my sister became so despondent, she continually thought about pulling, turning into traffic when she was driving on the highway. Like, she was so depressed. She was so lost for any kind of attention and love. I think she's a really alluring, sad character, actually. I'm glad she has a new husband and a new job.
I sort of wondered if the story was being written today, if it would have been written in the same way or in a different way, because this is the first one we've read that doesn't have the author in it at all. And I wonder, I was sort of interested in what the writer was thinking and, and what their interaction with the characters were, because clearly, like, he was going to prison, you know, he was writing to people. I just sort of, I wonder.
Do you think that first person is more popular now? Has it gotten more popular, more common?
I think it's certainly gotten more common in newspaper journalism.
Yeah.
But this is a good example.
It's so restrained. It you know, when the new details unfold, he just puts them out there, and I think that used to be a hallmark of these Wall Street Journal stories, where they would, it was, you know, very, very coolly and sort of succinctly written so that it would speak for itself. And I think they're very, very hard to write. You have to get all the excess out of them and just, you know, keep going with detail after detail. And I think it's a really good job. I'm glad there's no first person, because you sort of see it, you know, he's an absent character, and you slightly see he thought it was, you know, absurd and crazy and interesting is sort of what you take away from it.
I think that's right. Like, without the first person would have been distracting. Like, it's not like it's about these people. Like, it's like that's where its power was. The thing that I would have liked to have read more about is the idea of this law, where, like, if you're part of this murder, and it would have been interesting, like in Washington, you know, where I do my usual journalism, it's like criminal justice reform is this big issue. And that thing where, like, if you're part of this murder and they can't prove that you committed the murder, you go to prison for life. Like, I could have read a lot more about that.
There's a huge,
pretty widespread in the States, actually.
Yeah, there's a big gender component to that too, because it's why there are such high incarceration rates for women who are accomplices in these crimes. They're like, you know, dating a guy who's a drug dealer, or get somehow hooked up with their husband or something, and they happen to be in the car when there's a shootout with the cops, and they get the same charge. So yeah, it's a provocative issue. What, Mike, were you able to glance through that blog? With
like more of a summary of the story.
Says that her mother, the reader says her mother, father, and son died all within a few years. Pui-Wing, real quick, did you, forgive my ignorance here, do you recall writing these types of pieces when you were at the Journal? Any particular?
Yeah, I mean, there was a real emphasis on a narrative journalism with these page one stories, and it went through a very rigorous reporting and editing process, and that's changed a lot in the last few years under Murdoch, ownership. And I think that's what you guys are alluding to when you say the Journal used to do these sort of great narrative pieces. If we're all going to end this call in a bit and go read one of your pieces, what's one that you remember fondly in this vein? Oh gosh. You know, I guess one about Steve Jobs and when he launched iTunes back in the day, and how that whole effort came together. That was a page one story, and that unfolded in a sort of a very narrative approach, and also very sort of, we tried to be very spare in the writing and sort of convey all the sort of Hollywood personalities that were involved, and how he corralled everybody, how Jobs corralled everybody and put that whole effort together.
Right.
So that was a fun one. But I think just going back to the first person element, I don't think that even today you would see that much of that in the Journal. They really, you know, try and avoid having the reporters be, you know, central to any narrative. And again, they just want to put the reporter second, I think, in most of these pieces. So even though first person is a lot more common in many other newspapers, I don't think you would see it that much. And I still read the Journal every day, and I don't see it pop up.
Do you encourage your reporters to do it?
I think where it makes sense, absolutely, because it can aid a narrative. It can give a different perspective. It's sort of what Vanessa, what you were saying about how you would have been interested in how some of the reporting unfolded here. You know, was the writer here, you know, well, I guess you could get a sense of that because there was the sort of plexiglass divide that she was speaking through, but he never had to use the word I for us to know that he was seeing her in person, I suppose.
That was what was nice about it, though. It's not first person, but he's so present, and it's because of his choice to be sympathetic with almost every character in the story. I think a lot of writers would either play it very straight or speaking of the Tiger King, and I don't mean the story because I thought the story was quite nice, but the way the documentary unfolds, it doesn't feel like there's a humanity or a sympathy with everyone. And I think the writer, without putting himself in it, wrote it very much with his own fingerprint. You know, it was very much a story that he wrote because he felt a certain way about how these people, even the fact that he probably spent months getting in touch with people at prisons and talking to the whole family. And this is a nothing story, you know, and wouldn't ordinarily be a front page story, but I think it just, for whatever reason, it probably interested him. And he decided to take a very sympathetic approach to it. So it actually works better than the sort of arbitrary, often useless first person that just reminds the reader like, hey, I wrote this story, which I think too much of the first person stuff is. I think it's way more masterful to sit behind this and write this stuff and aggregate everything and then leave yourself out of it. You know, it reminded me, it's not nearly as good, but someone like Catherine Boo, when she writes, you look at her material and you're like, my God, she was there at every single moment, but doesn't include herself. And you don't feel that whole because I think it's filled with their choices as a journalist.
Did anyone think that her family really forgave her for what she did?
Well, there were some great details in there where the father forgave her, but then died soon after. And the mother's like, you know, you killed him. He died early because of you. And then the husband's weird, you know, sort of lovely, actually, statement about how it would always be private. He didn't want to talk about it. And her sister talked. Like, I felt like, I don't know, it felt, and the mother kept visiting her in prison. Like, it felt like there was some, you know, effort to understand and effort to forgive, which I quite liked.
I didn't feel that at all. I felt like, I mean, like that he, you know, he got a quickie divorce immediately from her. And the mother, it feels to me like there's a very specific culture that she grew up in and that she lived in that is kind of sketched out a little bit in the piece, but I was really interested in hearing more about it. You know, that whole idea of like stiff upper lip, that you don't ever express your feelings, that everything is great, that you squish everything down. I don't think it was necessarily specific to her family, but I think actually is like part of that certain kind of like Catholic Midwestern community, and clearly had a lot to do with shaping her and getting her to the point where she was so desperate that she ran off with this guy. And I was kind of interested in that and the psychology of that.
Well, also that amazing detail about how in her high school class, like a huge percentage of people got married to their first boyfriend or girlfriend, because the idea was you couldn't sleep with anyone before marriage. So she met him when she was 20 and that was it for her, you know? And that was a sort of interesting little insight into the culture there too, I thought.
Yeah, I think they seemed like they found it just incomprehensible and unforgivable and just wanted to, they just wanted to get away from it.
I thought the mother's quote was devastating. That it seemed to me that there was no way that they were actually, you know, that she was forgiving her daughter. You killed your dad. I mean, that's like,
I had this like vision of her going to visit the prison and just being like, you are a sinner, like you are wrong.
Yeah.
I also found it incredible.
You're Googling at what she's been up to more recently. One of the attendees is asking, did she express any regret? Did you come across any of that?
You know, I didn't come across regret. I think that she felt like because she was using this unleashed rubric, I think she felt like she was, you know, liberated, basically, that the whole experience liberated her from that stiff upper lip culture. And that seems to be what she wanted to convey to people now, that, you know, she had been liberated from all of that, and that the experience had been liberating, even though it had landed her behind bars at the same time.
Right.
I found it intriguing that the family never spoke. I mean, the husband's absolute determination to never say a word. I mean, when these big scandals erupt in small places, if you cover crime or your metro, families always talk. They get the spotlight. There's 100 cameras in front of them. They want to talk about what happened or explain it, maybe even their moment of fame, but they were so absolute in being like, nope, not interested, until the very end. And it's clear the reporter probably tried many times to do it. I think that also says something about the culture she grew up in.
It's true. Yeah.
I mean, to go back to like Mike's point about her going to visit the prison, and if she had never gone with the dogs in the first place, then like the whole story would have fallen apart. Don't you feel like she would have imploded in some other way? That like actually, I feel like that was an important point, like turning moment in the plot.
What
There's so
would have
much pent up.
So if she doesn't get into the dogs in the prison, like what would have happened to her marriage? What have happened to her life? And how many people like her are out there that didn't get caught up in something like this, you know? And it was,
I guess, are you wondering whether she would have just continued for the rest of her life to be in an unhappy, unfulfilling marriage, or would she, if something else blown it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like she probably wouldn't have continued. That clearly, like the steam was building up so much that it would have had to erupt in some way. And if it wasn't taking dogs to the prison, it would have been something else.
Right.
But the prison is so crucial because it was all those single, desperate men telling her she was pretty. That, so the way her life was going to erupt was she was going to have an affair or whatever, and she might not have had that much chance, except if she hadn't gone to the prison. So I think the prison was an interesting aspect of the whole thing.
there's like a ton has obviously been written about prisons, but I got a chance to spend like several weeks in a prison, not because I was in trouble, but for a story several years ago. And it truly captures the idea of like prison and the desperation. Like I completely see this unfolding, and just how like the slightest interesting or different thing to come across, a prisoner would come across, would intrigue them because of how mundane and desperate prison is. It just completely like captured it in a way that, even though it's not necessarily just like a prison story, it totally got that right.
Yeah. Cool. Good one, Azam. Nice pick.
Thank you.
So we'll do it again next week. Thank you, guys. Nice to have you, Sarah.
Very nice to be here. Thank you so much. Nice to
All
see
right,
you.
guys.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
Hi, guys. Great talking to you guys.